Welcome to the latest episode of the Catalyst Health and Wellness Coaching Podcast. My name is Brad Cooper, and I'll be your host. And today's episode is one that, just personally, I've been looking forward to for months. We got this guy on the calendar months ago, and it's finally here. We're going to be interviewing Alex Hutchinson. Alex is the author of the book Endure. Easily my favorite book in the past year, but you could probably extend that out to the past decade. It's that good. You've got to get your hands on this thing. Again, it's called Endure. Let me tell you a little bit about Alex. Alex Hutchinson, PhD, is a columnist for Outside Magazine and was a longtime columnist for Runner's World. That's where I first came across him. A National Magazine Award winner, he is a regular contributor to the New Yorker Online, pens the weekly Jockology column in the Toronto Globe and Mail, and writes for the New York Times. 538 recently named him as one of their favorite running science geeks. He was a two-time finalist in the 1,500 meters at the Canadian Olympic Trials and represented Canada internationally in track, cross-country, road racing, and mountain running competitions. He holds a PhD in physics. Imagine that as far as what you're going to hear him talk about. He holds a PhD in physics from the University of Cambridge and has worked as a researcher for the U.S. National Security Agency. He currently lives in Toronto, Canada, with his family, including 2- and 4-year-old kids. Just a reminder, you can access additional resources, including a transcript of this episode, at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. And please, as always, don't hesitate to reach out to us. If you have questions about this podcast, you have questions about your career, the idea of wellness coaching, that's what we're here for. So you can reach out to us at results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Now, on with the latest episode of the Catalyst Health and Wellness Coaching Podcast. All right, well, we are very pleased. I should say I am very pleased to have Dr. Alex Hutchinson on board today for the podcast interview. Alex, you've heard the bio about him. He wrote my favorite book of 18, but I could probably go back another 5 or 6 years and give him credit for probably my favorite book of the decade. Outstanding book. And then if you're not following him on Twitter, if you're not reading his insights in formerly Runner's World and now Outside Magazine, you just got to do it. It is so intriguing. Just every single thing he posts, it seems like. And I'm probably making him blush, even though we're not in the same room at this point. But Alex, we'll get into some of those topics, but I'd love to get a little bit more background on you. Your history is just interesting. You had a PhD in physics from the University of Cambridge. Did you have this in mind when you were doing that, or kind of how did you get where you ended up today?
First of all, Brad, thank you for the kind words. I am blushing and I appreciate it. In terms of how I ended up here, yeah, no, this was not some sort of long-term master plan where I was like, yes, this is, if I go study physics, this will get me to the point where I can spend my days thinking about running and reading cool studies about it. And even looking back, I'm not sure how it happened myself. Like, and the more I look back, the more I'm like, how did I decide to leave physics? I had nothing. I didn't know anything about journalism when I was doing a postdoc after my PhD, and a couple of years into my postdoc, I left to go do a master's in journalism. And at that point, I had zero journalism experience. I hadn't worked on student papers. I didn't know anything about it. So it was a real leap into the unknown. And I sort of like, I give my, past self credit. I'm like, hey, good job, Alex. At one point, at least you were willing to take some big risks, in pursuit of, I guess, what I was pursuing was the opportunity to spend my days thinking about things that I really find interesting, and to have flexibility and to have some autonomy, to be able to make decisions about how I spent my time. And really that's when I was initially thinking about journalism, as best I can remember. One of the things what attracted me was the idea that, yeah, whatever I'm interested in, that can be a story. I can pursue that. I can write that, and I can make my own decisions about what's interesting and how to spend my time, rather than I wasn't a sort of, Watergate kind of, I dream of being a journalist. It was more an opportunity to pursue my interests. And so I'm lucky that it's worked out the way it has. And to be honest, looking ahead, I don't know I'm not sure I know where I'm headed over the next decades, but hopefully the same sort of principles of just trying to do something that's compatible with a life of curiosity and autonomy will be possible.
Outstanding. So now we won't get into the coaching piece yet, but in terms of like your articles I first found you through Runner's World and now Outside Magazine, there are so many options. One of the things I've discovered in doing my PhD research is A, how much I didn't know, but B, how many rabbit trails there are. Like they are literally endless. When you dial in a specific article that you're going to review and put into words that all of us can understand, how do you narrow it from the 10 million options to the one?
Yeah, that's well, I struggle with that question every week, to be honest. But I would say if I had to put one main principle for me that I've kind of stuck with is, and that's made my life a lot easier, is I tend to start with answers rather than questions. So, if I'm thinking about what do people who read Runner's World or Outside want to know, I mean, there's a ton of good questions, like how fast should I run every day? Exactly how much rest should I take between, after a marathon or between, intervals in a workout? And scientifically speaking, the answer to those questions is almost always, I'm not really sure. And so then I can look up 50 studies, none of which really answer the exact question I'm trying to answer, or call up a bunch of experts and get their opinions. But I'm not, my whole goal as a science journalist is not to just rehash people's opinions, but to actually assess what evidence we have. And the shortcut for me is to, instead of starting with the questions, look through, I have half a dozen or, 10 journals that I check regularly. Just flip through the abstracts of all the papers going out. And when I find one that's interesting, then now I know an answer. It's maybe not exactly the question that everyone's wondering about, but it's easier to broaden and extrapolate from that answer and say, here are some questions that we might be able to answer with that, with this new research, than to start with the open-ended question and then, like you said, to follow 1,000 different rabbit holes, none of which exactly lead where you want to go. So the result is that I don't necessarily answer exactly the questions that people are wondering about, but it allows me to start where I know there's going to be some interesting data and something new, instead of writing the billionth piece of advice on, how long your long run should be, or whatever the case might be.
Well, you're doing a good job. So whatever your process is, keep it going. Now, let's dip our toe into the health and wellness coaching realm, since most of the folks listening to this are going to be in that background or pondering going that route. Are there a couple of topics that you've written about recently, or it doesn't have to be recently, last couple of years, that you think would be beneficial to them? So not necessarily the elite athlete or even the elite masters athlete, but more things that would be helpful for their often non-athletic clients across the broader span. So food, fitness, finances, relationships, stress management, all those kinds of things. Anything that pops into your mind as we talk more generically about wellness?
Yeah, one of the fields that I've just started to scratch the surface of, that, and I don't want to position myself as an expert on it, but that I'm starting to think is much more important than I realized, is a subfield called exercise psychology, which doesn't ask, how hard your heartbeat has to work at a given level, but it asks, how does a given workout make you feel? And there's a guy whose name I can't pronounce. I think he's at Iowa State, Patty Ekakakis. But my apologies if I'm saying that wrong. Who's really at the forefront of this field, and he's really strident in arguing that we're really missing the boat when we focus in on, the nuances of how much lactate is produced at a given exercise, and what really matters. Everyone knows what's good for them, and the really hard thing is to get people to follow up on these habits like exercise, but including, eating well and sleeping well and all these other things. And so trying to understand how a given workout makes you feel, and why some things, some workouts might make, or some activities might make you feel good and others less good, why some people feel better after a workout and others find it really difficult. That's going to be the question that's going to determine whether your client is still doing what you told him or her a year from now or 5 years from now. More than the details of whether you've really optimized, whether the routine is perfect, it's like, can they live with it for their life? Or for the rest of their lives? Is it something that's going to just become a habit? So I'm really interested in that field of trying to understand not what people should do, but how we convince them to keep doing what they already know they should do.
You've almost summed up what health and wellness coaching is. It's not telling them how to do something or laying out the perfect plan. It's drawing out of them why does it matter to them? So I'll need to look that guy up. So Nike 2 Hour Project, loved it. Loved the documentary they did on it. Just so many intriguing things, and the fact that the one guy they thought was pretty much optimized before they started making all their adjustments ended up being the one guy who came closest. You want to tell us a little bit about that briefly for folks that aren't familiar with it, and then any lessons from that that similarly wouldn't be elite specific, but we could apply to our own lives?
Yeah, so the background here is Nike spent, this was their Breaking Two project where they staged a marathon race in May of 2018, but they'd been working on it for about 3 years beforehand and spent about, and I don't know, they wouldn't tell me how much, but tens of millions of dollars trying to perfectly optimize the ultimate fastest marathon possible to see if someone could get under 2 hours. And they selected three runners, and eventually a guy named Eliud Kipchoge ran 2 hours, 0 minutes, and 25 seconds, which was at the time 2.5 minutes faster than the world record. So, it wasn't a sub 2 hour marathon, but it was an astounding performance. And it really sparked a lot of discussions of like, okay, wow, Nike was doing all these things, developing all this technology, pulling all the levers and spinning all the knobs and so on. Which were the knobs that mattered? What is it that allowed Kipchoge to run 2.5 minutes faster than the world record? And if I had to sort of narrow it down to one takeaway, and like we could talk for hours about, they have new running shoes with curved carbon fiber plate in them that are supposed to be 4% more efficient. And they held the race on a Formula One racetrack in Italy with, perfectly optimized curves and, totally flat, yada, yada, yada. The lesson that I think is most interesting is all the stuff that didn't really make a difference. So they had, for months and months, they had all the runners in the project wearing, a GPS watch and heart rate monitor and stuff. They were uploading their training nightly back to Nike headquarters where it was being fed into, a supercomputer to analyze exactly whether they were getting the balance of recovery and stimulus right and whether they should be training faster or slower or harder or, really trying to use every bit of science they could. And like you said, a minute ago, Kipchoge, the guy who did best, who came closest to the 2 hour marathon, they were analyzing his training and trying to come up with what should we tell him about how to change his training. And at first they thought they had a few ideas, but their ultimate conclusion was, we shouldn't tell him anything. What he's doing is just fine. We have nothing to teach Eliud Kipchoge. And this is a guy who's training in a rural camp in Kenya, he's an Olympic champion, multimillionaire, but he's living in a shared room in a dormitory, in an earthen floor, cleaning the toilets, taking his turn with the chores. Very simple. And his coach, there's no supercomputer. They're just doing get out, do the hard work, then recover. All the stuff that again, we all know. So there was no secret. There was no this is the training we needed to do to run a 2 hour marathon. Instead, it was execute what we know and execute it perfectly. Eliminate the distractions. You don't need fancy GPS. You don't need the latest, heart rate variability monitoring, blah, blah, blah. Some of this stuff is interesting. Some of the stuff may be useful, but Kipchoge was able to achieve arguably one of the greatest marathon runs in history with a very straightforward approach. And it was about executing the basics well, not about the technology. And that's what I kind of take away from the Breaking Two thing.
I love it. And again, I would love to hear you talk for 3 more hours on that one. Let's turn to your book a little bit. The title, The Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. When you sat down to write that book, did your research, and I know it was a long-term project. This wasn't something you sat down for 6 months and wrote it up. It took years. But what did you discover that surprised you? You were already in essentially the field. You were already an elite runner yourself. You'd already written multiple articles about this. As you pulled the book together, were there things where you went, didn't think I'd see that?
Yeah, I mean, like you're saying, it was a long process and it was sort of a gradual accretion of knowledge. So for most of what I was writing about, I kind of could see the train coming in the distance, and there wasn't a lot that caught me totally by surprise. The biggest exception was the part I wrote about freediving. So I have a chapter on oxygen because any runner will know that or any endurance athlete, you're breathing hard. It feels like you're running out of oxygen. So I wanted to know what happens when you actually run out of, like, what does it feel like to really run out of oxygen? And so I was looking at high altitude mountain climbers and free divers. And that led me to this sort of question, the sort of basic question, well, how long can you go without breathing? And so, you know, I would invite listeners before I tell them the answer to think about what do you think the record for breath holding is? And I don't mean with any like trickery, like
Sure.
breathing pure oxygen, like David Blaine did for his stunt a while ago. Just like you're there, okay, you're going to hold your breath. How long can you hold your breath? The record is 11 minutes, and I think it's 11 minutes and 35 seconds. That's the official record. There's an unofficial one that's maybe 10 seconds longer or something. And that just blew my mind. And that like led me down, you know, one of those rabbit holes you mentioned earlier of like, okay, I got to understand more about this. After the book came out, so this didn't appear in the book, but I had a chance to interview the guy who recently set the American record for breath holding, which I think is 8 minutes and 35 seconds. A guy named Brandon Hendrickson. He actually lives in Kansas City of all places, but he's a free diver. And he was taking me through the stages of what goes on and what, you know, the difference between what feels like your limits. So in his dive, after about 4 minutes, his breathing muscles started to contract involuntarily. These are called involuntary breathing movements. And it's basically your body deciding you're out of oxygen, you have to breathe, you're done. And so for any of us who hold our breath, even like for most people, those might start after 90 seconds, 2 minutes. And it feels like, wow, I reached the point where I really had to breathe. And so it was a real eye-opener to me to realize, okay, he reached that point at like 4 minutes, 4.5 minutes. He held his breath for 8.5 minutes. So the point where it felt like he totally hit the physical wall, that was halfway to where his actual limits were. And because it's a warning system. Like physiologically what it is your brain's detecting high carbon dioxide levels, not low oxygen levels. So and that's just a signal to try and prevent you from actually getting to the point where you run out of oxygen, because that is obviously quite serious if you run out of oxygen. But so for me, that became a sort of metaphor for the general idea of the difference between, you know, a yellow light and a red light, between a warning sign and a stop sign. That there can be a huge margin between what feels like your limits and what your actual limits are.
Yeah, great example. I'm thinking of that with our research study we're working on right now. That is, yeah, the yellow light, red light is a great analogy. Let's talk practically a little bit here. So, in your own life, were there some different discoveries you made as you were doing the research, pulling the book together, that you found to be most applicable for you in the things that you're dealing with, physiologically or life in general?
Yeah, this is the question I always hope no one will ask. It's like, well, you wrote about how to do this stuff. Are you actually doing this stuff? It's like, well, I'm planning to real soon, man, real soon. No, it's interesting because there's a lot of things that I came across in writing the book where I'm like, okay, this isn't just a vague idea anymore. I'm looking at the evidence and I'm like, this really can make a difference. But there's a big difference between, you know, as everyone who thinks about exercise knows, there's a difference between knowing it's good for you and actually taking the step of doing it. And it's interesting because for me, daily exercise is just totally ingrained, and it takes virtually no mental effort for me to go out and
it's just
I
who you
enjoy
are.
getting out for my exercise. I haven't made that leap for some of the things like motivational self-talk, sort of taking control of my internal monologue, or maybe the best metaphor best example rather is mindfulness, because it's not just me. I think there's probably 100 million people in North America who are convinced that mindfulness is really, really good for you and has all sorts of wonderful effects. And hopefully just knowing that will mean that I'll get those benefits. It's like, no, you actually have to put in the work. You actually have to do it. And so, I mean, and I would say that for, like, again, sticking with the mindfulness example, there are elements of mindfulness that I try and incorporate. You know, I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and dealing with them, I love them greatly, of course, but dealing with them requires a lot, or can benefit from a lot of mindfulness. And I'm always trying to remind myself of some of these principles of, like, just be in the moment and, experience my frustration, observe it, don't respond to it emotionally, yada, yada, yada. But it's just knowing that, or just thinking about it, is not the same as putting in some disciplined practice to make these things a real part of your life and your day. So I would say I'm sort of, at the bottom of the mountain. I know where the mountain is, and I know where the path is, but I'm far from having sort of ascended to the summit of masterful life control.
So, not a question I plan to ask, but that's kind of what the coaches are trying to get people to move forward in areas that maybe they started their coaching session through their employer or whatever with nothing in mind. And then the conversation leads in a certain direction. They start talking about, I'll just use your example of mindfulness, and then putting into practice. Would there be something someone could do with you? Someone could ask the question, is there something you think that would turn that dial just that extra little bit to cause those to be put into practice?
You know, if I knew what that was, I would. I think the answer is undoubtedly yes. I think that somewhere in my sort of life activities, there's something that's holding me back, or some excuse that I'm making that's not valid, or some I'm convincing myself I don't have time when I do, or whatever the case may be. Is I don't know where the blockage is, and I should probably figure it out. But yeah, undoubtedly, like it's not that I'm intellectually convinced that the benefits would outweigh whatever inconvenience or cost it would take. And I don't think it's not like I live in Siberia and there are no, accessible opportunities to study mindfulness. Even if I did, you can do things on the internet these days. So it's just, I'm human. It's
right.
There are undoubtedly ways. And I think part of it for me has been over the last few years, it's been like, okay, I'm going to make my life better once I get the book done. I'm going to make my life better once the book is published. I'm going to make my life better once I've finished promoting the book. So it's been one of those things where I've put off a lot of things, including, I'm looking around me, including like cleaning my desk off. It's like, wow. So that's been a convenient excuse for procrastination. I need to prepare to move beyond that for sure.
Well, I think it's a helpful thing for the coaches to hear you say what you just said, because we're all human, but you've got it kind of dialed in. I mean, you've got the physical piece part of your life. You've done all this research. You're doing that on an ongoing basis. And yet you're saying, you know what? I still struggle. And I think that's healthy for the coaches to hear and realize it's not just their client. This is everybody. We all have issues. We all got things we're trying to work through. And in spite of the fact that we get it, we know it, intellectually it's there, it doesn't turn it into application. So I appreciate your honesty with that. If you were to add one more chapter to your book based on the things you've learned since you put that cover on and you shipped it off, what would you include in that chapter?
Yeah, I think my answer to that actually grows directly from what we were just talking about, because probably the number one question I've gotten from people is like, wow, these are amazing ideas. What are the details of how we put this into practice? And my answer has been like, that's not my department. Like, that's not my, that's not my skill set. I'm interested in the ideas, and there are other people whose personalities, whose interests, whose strengths make them suited for really understanding how to implement these things in the real world. And to be honest, I've had people get in touch with me and ask if I would give them, life coaching. And I've replied, like, I appreciate the offer, but look at the book. You can tell the book is super strong on ideas, super strong on, at least if I do say so myself, it's strong on the theory. It's weak on the implementation. It doesn't it sings the praises of motivational self-talk, but it doesn't really tell you how to do that, because that's not where I'm strongest. And I think I let that be a bit of an excuse to me I left the book a little bit short of where it could have been, because I stuck with what I was most interested in and didn't do the heavy lifting of trying to really understand the stuff that I hadn't already kind of mastered. So, I feel like if there was going to be another chapter, it would make a lot of sense for that chapter to be, here are 5 things you can do with really clear guides of how you can implement some of the ideas that we've discussed in the previous 13 chapters or whatever it was. So yeah, I think the practical implementation is really kind of the next step, and the thing that's maybe missing a little bit.
Very interesting, because that's the world we live in on a daily basis. So maybe that's why I appreciated so much what you presented, because it was the gap that we often have. So very interesting. You personally, you were very honest with us a few minutes ago, but I'd love to hear you expand, if you don't mind, share with our listeners
what's an area of health and wellness, fitness aside, it can be any area, that you've been kind of, this is the journey you're on right now. You're struggling with, you mentioned you have a 2 and a 4-year-old. Maybe it's something around family, relationships, finance, just, is there another area that you feel like this is kind of my journey and I don't mind sharing where I'm at with it and some of the struggles and some of the successes that you found aside from the book?
Yeah, sure. I mean, don't get me into the kids. It's a struggle right now, and obviously it's a very rewarding struggle, but it's a challenging time. But like honestly, the biggest thing I don't know if struggle is the right word, but the kind of dilemma I'm really chewing over right now, it has to do with goal setting, and trying to figure out where I want to be in 5 years and in 20 years or whatever the case may be. Because this really, and when we were chatting about this a little bit before we started this interview, my book came out a year ago, and the sort of obvious question is, what's next? Am I going to do another book? And I'd like to do another book. But the next question is, well, what's the book going to be about? And to answer that question, I really have to figure out what it is that I'm after in my career. What am I after financial success? Am I after, influence? Am I after, recognition from peers? And if so, which people am I after recognition from? Because there are topics that I could write about that would really resonate in the endurance community, or I could try and get, write for the science journalism community, a really hard-nosed evidence-based thing, or I could try and write something literary. These are all things that are important to me, all elements of my identity. And then, as I said, I look at my kids and my family, and I look at there's a river. So here's where, in terms of the things I've been thinking of, I read a book called The Nature Fix in September about the sort of really transformative power of spending time in natural environments and looking at the science of why it is good for us both physically and mentally. And I was really affected by it, and I went out and bought a secondhand kayak, like within a week of finishing the book, because I live about a block from a river. It's an urban river, but it's still a very nice river. I thought, yeah, I need to be able to just walk a block down to the river, get in the kayak, and spend a Tuesday morning kayaking instead of sitting at this stupid computer. And it's like, well, if I don't sit at the stupid computer, it's going to take me a year longer to write my next book. So, we're obviously all, me included, constrained by real world things like needing to pay the mortgage and things like that. But I'm in a relatively lucky situation where, my career is going reasonably well, and I have a lovely family. And so I have to decide how much of myself I want to give for different goals, and which is going to be more important to me. Is it going to be to have gone on a weekly kayak by myself along the river once a week every summer for the next 10 years, or to have put out one more book, to have had a book be more successful, to have reached more people? And I'm trying to frame this in a way that it's not like obvious what the right answer is, because I don't know what the right answer is.
Mm-hmm.
But I think maybe I'm tilting it a little way, because I'm thinking really carefully about what's valuable to me. And so I bought this kayak. I joined a Friday night pickup basketball game that meets every Friday night. I'm trying to think carefully about the things, social connections and the things that are going to make my present days more valuable, and not always focused on, future glory. I mean, I put glory in quotes, but yeah. So that's a rambling answer, but that's kind of the big question that's been weighing on me for the last few months, and I think I'm going to have to do some really heavy thinking about it in the next 6 months, say, because I'm going to have to decide what comes next. And once you make that decision, like my last book, it was a journey that was 8 to 10 years. And so whatever decision I make, it's not something I'm going to want to bail on after a year or two. I got to make sure it's that I'm committed to whatever journey that is.
I love it. Recent podcast, we were talking about the value of a theme first, or a life vision first, before you set the goals. And you basically said the exact same thing. It doesn't do you any good to say, here's my goal, when it may not be congruent with the person you want to become. It's kind of that idea of who before what. And frankly, once you get the who, the what kind of answers itself. There's really not a lot of struggle with that next piece. So thanks for laying that. That's good stuff.
A lot of our listeners who may have previously been focused on coaching endurance athletes, runners, triathletes, that kind of thing, they're now expanding into more the broad wellness piece or well-being. Any advice you'd have for them about some of those benefits on the well-being side that will help them with their former athletic clients.
Yeah, I do think there's a ton of crossover, and I'm sure you agree, between the things that, make you successful as an athlete and make you successful or happy in life. And, a couple of examples that spring to mind for me, things that have been always a part of my life as a runner are, for example, getting outside every day, going for a run along in a nice natural environment. I was talking about this earlier. And, meeting training partners, getting together to do a workout. And so I think about some of those things. It's like, time outside in nature, social bonding, deliberately arranging time to meet up with friends, to do some activity. I think that's stuff that's really actionable outside the athletic context, and maybe it's not meeting up for a run, maybe it's meeting up for some other reason, but, so drawing on some of those things that athletes have always valued. It's like you talk to runners and it's like, I love meeting my friends for their Sunday long run. And I love getting out, really just getting outside into the peaceful, trails and forest and having some time to think by myself and these sorts of things. Well, you can think about those things in a non-athletic context, just in terms of a general wellness context, I think.
Nice. Very nice. And then on the other side of the coin, we've got folks that are wellness coaches, and they're not purposely seeking out endurance athletes, but they just end up with them. Any tips for them when they don't have that background to effectively, or at least start to effectively help these folks that might be pretty serious endurance athletes?
Yeah. And again, I think there's a ton of crossover, and it's like, if you think about some of the things that people in wellness have been talking about for, forever, getting enough sleep, controlling your stress levels, being clear about your priorities, about how you want to spend your time. I think these are just more recently being recognized finally as crucial ingredients to athletic performance. So, sleep is an obvious one, but, controlling your stress and more generally just thinking carefully about how you spend your time. Because especially if you're talking, if you're talking to an Olympic athlete, then maybe they're spending all their time training anyway. But for most of us, we're balancing our athletic goals with all sorts of other commitments and goals in our lives. And so, and it's easy. I think you'll hear a lot of athletes like, "Oh, I just wish I could train, half an hour more. I wish I could do this. I wish I could do that, but it's not realistic in my life." And I think one of the sort of important things in wellness in general is thinking carefully about your priorities and how you spend your time. What's important? Where are the places in your life that you're frittering away time that you could be using for things that are really of value to you? And if you've got a serious athlete, and if you can help them figure out what is the value of their time, where do they want to spend their resources, and how important is it to them to get that extra hour of sleep that could make a big difference. I think you'll be doing them a big service athletically as well as just in the context of general wellness.
Fantastic. All right, so we'll kind of wrap it up here. Any final words of wisdom you'd like to share, either with current coaches that maybe not be thinking about some of the things that you've looked at, or people that are on the fence and thinking, I think I'd like to go this route? Any final words you'd like to share with them?
I think I've squeezed out most of the wisdom I have, but if there's one thing that I kind of try and encourage people to reflect on, it's to think about the difference between short-term and long-term goals, and to really not get too caught up in the short term and focus. I mean, we all need short-term goals, don't get me wrong, but to really get motivated about where you can be in 5 years rather than in 6 months. Because, it's a cliche to say that most of us really overestimate what we can do in the short term, but I think also underestimate what we can do in the long term. And so people get amped up about what they want to do next month and miss that target, and then maybe let that throw them off. And so I think when you're helping people figure out where they want to go, really just, paint a picture of the incredible possibilities for them if they're willing to put in not a month, but a year or a few years pursuing a goal.
That is fantastic advice. I appreciate it. How can people find you? Twitter, you're pretty active on Twitter. It's @SweatScience. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, and that's the social media venue that I've found has worked best for me in terms of interacting with people. So, Twitter, and that's where, if I have new articles and things like that, or just things I find interesting, I post them there. I do have a website, alexhutchinson.net, if you want to sort of explore my, undergraduate GPA or anything like that. But, Twitter is probably the logical place to go.
Perfect. Well, sir, I really appreciate it. This was fun. It was great information. And I think in addition to everything you bring on the research side, just your honesty. And we all struggle with a lot of the same things, and you're not immune to that. So thanks for laying that out for us. And thanks for taking the time with us today.
Well, thanks, Brad. I appreciate the therapy session, and hopefully I'll be able to work through some of my issues next time we talk.
Sounds great. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
That was fun. Just a couple of things I jotted down as I was listening back through this for the final editing process. First one, did you hear what he said about his career? Because I know a lot of you are in that place where you're sitting there thinking, do I really want to do this for the rest of my life? And that's what brought you to wellness coaching. You're thinking, well, maybe that's the route. And I'm not here to say it is, but he talked about, he had a PhD in physics, and he decided to go back and get a master's degree in journalism, and that put him in this role that it's not perfect. There's no such thing as perfect, but he's really loving what he's doing. It gives him that, he taught, what was the quote I wrote down? Do something that's compatible with a life of curiosity and that offers autonomy. You could tell those are the things important to him, and I know it's important for a lot of you too. So I don't know, maybe you want to get a PhD in physics and then get a master's in journalism, or you could think about the wellness coaching. But all kidding aside, if you hear some of the other things he talked about, and I think that's what I appreciated most about Alex in this interview, is I had a lot of respect for him coming in. I loved his book. He and I had communicated a few times. I'd read his articles for years, but it was his transparency, his honesty that really captured my attention. And hopefully you heard that too. And you appreciate that. And you saw that potential both in your own life and that of your clients. A couple of the things I wrote down, the pondering he's doing about his life pursuits going forward. You could hear he's really wrestling with that. And you're hearing that with your clients. That's what you're helping them through. You're helping them through these major hurdles in their lives that will determine not just the next 6 months, but much of the rest of their life. So again, super encouraging, and hopefully you heard that in there as well. And then the last thing I jotted down is there's a big difference between knowing it's good for you and actually doing it. He mentioned that a couple of times, not just in reference to other people, but again, that transparency of saying, hey, I struggle with it too. So those are, again, the things you're doing as a wellness coach, the impact you're having is helping people to realize that. And I just wanted to kind of bring that to to the forefront here and make sure you heard that. So a couple things coming up. We just announced the retreat. If you haven't heard about that, you might want to take a peek at that. That's going to be in September in Estes Park, Colorado. We're already having people register for it. There's an early registration discount, and people are jumping on that. For the certification itself, if that's something you're looking at, our next two, and obviously it depends on when you hear this, but our next two fast track programs in Colorado are February 23rd and 24th, and then June 1st and 2nd. Obviously, you can do the distance learning anytime you'd like, and there are 4 programs a year generally in Colorado. So if you miss those dates or they don't work, just take a peek at the website or reach out to us, and we can get you set up with the next one. We do love hearing from you. If you've got questions, if you have future topic ideas, we have just an incredible lineup over the next several weeks. But if you've got ideas, that's helpful to us. We love to hear those. And you can email us anytime at results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com. And there's a lot of resources to supplement this at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. So feel free to jump into those or reach out to us when you'd like. Folks, I appreciate you spreading the word. All of you who have subscribed, shared, provided the great ratings, we appreciate it. We're really not marketing this thing much, and so it's been a result of you sharing it, and I appreciate it. Until next time, let's all keep working towards what we like to call in this show, #better than yesterday, not just for ourselves, but for our clients. Make it a great day, and I'll look forward to speaking with you soon on the next episode of the Catalyst Health and Wellness Coaching Podcast.